I was going to say it takes me on to 2 points actually. The first question may be very hard to answer, but is why? Why did this group of elite individuals arrive at this conclusion? And the second, which I think we can deal with after, will be the role of big tech. But if I could ask you the first. So why do you think they arrived at this decision? Why was this
Yeah.
decided as being the best course to take?
I think, well, the this is where I part company with the Great Reset conspiracy theorists. I don't think that a group of senior scientists and owners of big tech companies, even Jeff Bezos, saw in this an opportunity to enrich themselves. Nor do I think that they had signed up to, Klaus Schwab's Great Reset agenda, in which they saw this as an opportunity to for technocratic elites to exert permanent control over the global population. I don't think it was because they anticipated introducing vaccine passports and creating a kind of social credit system in which you earned more credits if you keep your weight down and stay current with your vaccinations and the rest of it. I don't think there was a kind of malign agenda underpinning their embrace of the lockdown policy. I think it was more, most of them are politically liberal, and I think it just kind of fit neatly with their politics, their solution to any public crisis, including a public health crisis, is state intervention. They think that if there is something happening in the world which is posing a threat to large numbers of people, posing a threat to political stability, to the global economy, the way to address that problem is not to rely on people to self-correct their behaviour, but for the state to intervene and roll out this very expensive public program to enforce it in various authoritarian ways. That's just their default for dealing with any crisis. And no matter how many times we've seen throughout history politicians overreaching, the unforeseen consequences of these massive state-funded public programs, their ineffectiveness over the long term, the terrible infringements of people's liberties that they often involve. None of those lessons ever seem to stick. It's always their go-to default position. Crisis, right. Let's empower this group of public officials and with enormous budgets to solve the problem by intervening in a heavy-handed, draconian way. Always goes wrong. Doesn't matter. They still repeat it over and over again. And I think that's why and because most of the people running the world share this kind of liberal politics. That's why this solution, a lockdown, had such resonance with so many politicians and so many senior journalists and university vice chancellors. The intellectual, metropolitan, educated elite leapt on this as a great solution to this problem because they think the solution to every problem is a massive state-funded public intervention program, even though it never really works.
So big state against the individual. I suppose we're getting dangerously close to classic left-right division here, are we? Is it that kind of is it that simple, or it seems more
Well,
complex to me?
it's interesting how support or opposition, whether support or opposition to what are often called the non-pharmaceutical interventions, things like stay-at-home orders, school and business closures, mask mandates. Can you map the divisions over those policies onto a kind of left-right political map? And in America, yes, you can. There's a real division between the attitude of the governors of red states and the attitude of blue states, and it looks as though that's going to be the main dividing line in the next US presidential election, particularly if Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who's been probably the leading lockdown skeptic amongst kind of senior US politicians. That looks like it'll be the main dividing line in the next US presidential election. And it does divide along left-right lines in the US. It doesn't divide along left-right lines nearly so conveniently or neatly in the UK. I think for the most part, it's certainly true that people who vote Labour are probably more inclined to support the various COVID restrictions than people who vote Conservative. But, one of the disappointing things for people like me is that actually support for the COVID restrictions seems to be pretty widespread, regardless of how you voted. Even today, I think there was a YouGov poll yesterday. Admittedly, it was an online poll, so you have to take it with a pinch of salt because online polls aren't always accurate, particularly when, with something like this where it's new and you can't kind of compare the results to previous results and kind of adjust for those mistakes. Nonetheless, there was I think a YouGov poll yesterday which said that 64% of people supported mandatory vaccinations. Or I think they supported making the COVID boosters mandatory. That was quite shocking. And if you look at, but I don't think it was an outlier. Most opinion polls seem to find that support for things like mask mandates, vaccine passports, more COVID restrictions, that seems to be pretty widespread. It's still, less strong than it was last year, but still a majority of people are in favour of those things. And I think it's partly the legacy of the fear that the government managed to whip up last year. It takes a while for people to kind of become calm and rational again. And I think, if you look at, there's quite a lot of polling evidence that people wildly overestimate the infection fatality rate of COVID. And they also wildly overestimate how many people are likely to become hospitalised as a result of catching COVID-19. The reality is, people argue about what the infection fatality rate is, but I think in the most recent WHO bulletin, it's somewhere around 0.23%, which is to say, if you catch the disease, you have a 0.23% chance of dying from it, and your chances of hospitalisation aren't as low as that. But they're not that high either. For most people, this is a pretty mild disease with no lasting complications. But I think people do wildly overestimate how dangerous it is. They think of it as being more like Ebola. And for that reason, they're kind of quite enthusiastic about vaccine passports. I still think that the people who are unvaccinated pose a grave threat to public health, and if you're vaccinated, you're fine. But I think there's been a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of misinformation, funnily enough, put out by the other side, not by my side in this debate, and that has left the public terrified still. Less terrified than they were, but still scared enough, I think, to be enthusiastic about various restrictions, which I don't think will have any impact at all when it comes to suppressing the virus.
Well, I was going to suggest if a majority of people still support these NPIs, such as vaccine passports and mandatory boosters, should the government not just go along with them?
Well, governments have been going along with them across the West, and England is a real outlier now in not going along with them. Has that in common with some US states like Florida and Texas, but still an outlier. But no, I don't think they should go along with them. The thing about civil liberties is that they probably only ever will benefit a minority of people. Most people are not going to find themselves in a situation, at least in the immediate future, when their civil liberties are likely to be curtailed. But that doesn't mean that if a majority of people support the suspension of civil liberties, that they should be suspended. Rights are such that they don't depend upon the support of the majority. Rights exist to defend the minority, for the most part, against majorities. So, yeah, the fact that a majority of the British public may be in favour of COVID passports does not mean that the unvaccinated should have their liberties curtailed. They need to be protected from, an over anxious majority.
And with a government that has seemed, I don't want to be unfair here, but perhaps seems fairly guided by polling, are you optimistic that they will hold out and perhaps take decisions that are against the polling view of majority? Things like vaccine passports, things like mandatory boosters.
Yeah, I'm certainly not 100% confident. I've got a bet with James Delingpole, with whom I do a weekly podcast called London Calling, and I bet James £50 that there won't be another national lockdown in England between now and the end of the year, and nor will there be a lockdown for just the unvaccinated. And James is absolutely convinced, that £50 is already in his pocket. I think he's already spending it. But nonetheless, I'm about 60% confident that I'll win that bet, and still think getting even odds was a win for me. But I've been guilty of being over optimistic before. I didn't think. Initially, when the government refused to lock down and stuck doggedly to the pandemic preparedness strategy, I thought, well done, Boris. That's the guy I voted for. You're standing up to these hysterical calls to impose this untried, untested measure, which is likely to have disastrous, unforeseen consequences and cause a huge amount of collateral damage. And there's no evidence it will suppress infections at all. You are doing the right thing. You're holding out against all these people clamouring for you to do more. Well done. You're showing real character. This is the Churchillian leader I voted for. And then, about a week later, he completely capitulated and did a massive U-turn. And I thought, Christ, why did I vote for him? So, things could still change, but I think I'm still about 60% confident that he'll hold his nerve.
I was going to say, you know Boris reasonably well. Were you surprised when he capitulated?
I was disappointed, yes. Partly because I having known him a little bit for 30 plus years, and having kept up with his journalism, read some of his books, I was fairly and campaigned for him in 2019, or for his party. I was fairly confident that he, like me, was a libertarian conservative. I thought he was amongst the political leaders the closest to me philosophically. So when he seemed to cast aside his libertarian values, admittedly under a huge amount of political pressure, that was disappointing. Was it surprising? Well, not all that surprising. I think I think everyone who's been following Boris's career knows that he's always been quite pragmatic. No Margaret Thatcher when it comes to standing by his principles. Always pretty flexible. We know that he wrote 2 newspaper columns, one pro and one anti-Leave, before deciding where to jump in the EU referendum. Not all that surprising, but still disappointing.
And just to take you back slightly, we mentioned the elites, we mentioned big tech. I just want to take you back to big tech. Do you feel, in terms of, again, something like this podcast, should YouTube decide it's too dangerous to go up? Should they decide to take other action? Should something we tweet from it result in a suspension? Do you think this is a culture that's being shaped by the tech companies, or do you think they're seeking to take advantage of it, or is it neither of those? Why do you think big tech has come to play a role in deciding what shouldn't be broadcast, what shouldn't be published?
Well, I think in part it's because a lot of the vast majority of employees of big tech companies like Facebook, Google, are marinated in the same hyper liberal woke values. Um, uh, and when someone like Donald Trump says something inflammatory and provocative, when they decide to censor it and kick him off their platform, they don't think of themselves as I don't think they think of themselves as political actors who are just trying to do what they can to make sure their guy is elected and Trump doesn't get to communicate his message to potential voters. I think they think he is, the things he says are genuinely toxic, and often borderline, if not overtly, racist, and will stir up hatred and unrest. So I think they think of themselves as sort of custodians of the public interest. But it's just they define that public interest according to their own political values. But those political values, I think, sit a little bit in the background, and they're not kind of aggressive political actors. But I think that's part of it. But I also think that a lot of censorship on social media, on YouTube, for instance, is done by AIs. There is no human being sitting there, with a red pencil. They're computer algorithms, and if the reason YouTube videos with people like Shanatra Gupta and Carl Hennigan expressing skepticism about COVID dogma are taken down isn't because there's a human being who decides that this is endangering public health because it'll make people less likely to comply with things like social distancing and mask mandates. It's just because a number of people who feel very strongly about these issues, pro-lockdown zealots, complain to YouTube, and once YouTube gets enough complaints about a particular video, it automatically takes it down. It's the algorithm taking it down. It's not a human being. And often, if you push back, if you say, actually, this shouldn't have been taken down, I haven't violated your community standards, everything said in this video is scientifically evidenced, they put it back up. And that's because you actually reach a human when you appeal this decision. I think it's partly it's partly the kind of liberal biases of the human moderators, but I think it's more often the kind of the way in which the algorithms can be manipulated by activists on one side. Weirdly, if you're a lockdown zealot, you're much more likely to complain about a YouTube video challenging your point of view than if you're a lockdown skeptic about a YouTube video challenging your point of view. I mean, one of the oddities of this whole debate is that the people amongst the dissenting minority tend to be much more intellectually tolerant. They don't want to shut down their opponents. They want to debate them, as often as possible in public forums. So for that reason, we're sort of at a disadvantage because the people on the other side aren't intellectually tolerant. They don't want a public debate. They just want to silence dissenting voices, and they do that by deluging YouTube, Twitter, Facebook with complaints, and it's effective because the computers just react automatically.
I was going to say we're talking about very, very influential powers here: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and you've mentioned potentially a liberal bias amongst some of the senior executives, but also a flaw in the algorithm. Are these not things that really ought to be tackled at root source?
Yes, and my hope is that that there can be included in the forthcoming online safety bill a clause which makes it more difficult for social media companies to remove content for what are clearly political reasons. So if someone does, if Facebook removes one of your posts in response to activist complaints because they don't like your politics, not because there's anything inaccurate or false about it, there should be some remedy available to the person who's been censored in this way, which will be big enough to incentivize companies like Facebook to be less cavalier about allowing their complaints procedures to be weaponized in this way. That's my hope. I think that would be something that could be done. I mean, just on this point, Matt, I think where the conspiracy theorists may be onto something is that the owners of social media companies, the most senior managers, the largest shareholders, I think they do have a vested interest in promoting the values and policies of politicians like Boris Johnson, like Joe Biden, like Jacinda Ardern. Any politician who's in power, I think clearly the social media companies do have a vested interest in cozying up to them and not allowing their platforms to be used to whip up opposition to them because they're terrified about regulation. They realise that excessive regulation will eat into their profits, and they don't want, a bill to be passed in the British Parliament which will empower Ofcom to fine their executive tens of millions of pounds if they breach some duty of care. So I think they do have an incentive to largely be supportive of these various powerful politicians and powerful regulators and bureaucrats. And that's, I think, part of the reason why we've seen big tech aggressively promoting compliance with kind of the mainstream public health policies and censoring anyone who dissents from them. But I think it's just part of it.
So the anti-establishment idea is possibly wrong. There's a symbiotic relationship between the two, between sitting governments and big tech, possibly.
Yeah, well, I think that's I think that's pretty clear. Yeah.
Okay, and just to take us on to two final points. Cancel culture again. You suggested, particularly with some elements of wokery, that it's actually a very small minority who are most vocal and most supportive of these things. Surely one way of perhaps making a more representative society would be education, would be children, would be whether it's academics at university, whether it's teachers at school. Presumably they form some kind of bulwark against this if there's a minority who are creating a view larger than perhaps they ought to be able to. Do you think that's the case? Are our teachers and academics helping rein this in or not?
No. I think they're accelerants, if anything. Unfortunately, most academics, most teachers, when it comes to those three bodies of ideas I identified earlier as the unholy trinity, are aggressive enforcers of orthodoxy in all three areas: COVID, climate change, and wokery. One source of hope is that they may have succeeded in enlisting millennials into those causes, maybe even Generation Z. But it looks as though the generation coming up behind Generation Z, so people who are 13, 14, 15 now, are beginning to resist and beginning to question and criticize a little bit more. And maybe that's partly cyclical. They just want to differentiate themselves from the generation immediately above them. But it also might partly be because, 15 years ago, academics and teachers were probably in a beleaguered minority when promoting, critical race theory in schools. These were unorthodox, quite radical points of view. So they felt, they had the kind of frisson of being anti-establishment and being disruptive and being quite dangerous. But now, when it comes to, the idea of white privilege, for instance, that has become the absolute establishment orthodoxy across almost every institution, including this government. So it's quite difficult when promoting the concept of white privilege in universities and schools for teachers and academics to kind of retain that frisson of danger, that persuade people that this is a radical, disruptive, anti-establishment idea. For people 12, 13, 14, they're being bombarded, with propaganda from every direction, not just from their teachers, probably from their parents, from the mainstream media, on Instagram, on Snapchat, on YouTube. If the same messages, the same orthodoxy is coming at them from every conceivable direction, they're going to begin to rebel, and you do see that beginning to happen. So I'm hoping that the kind of that there will be a kind of natural correction, and that the generation currently coming up will be keener on free speech, keener on debate and discussion, on challenging prevailing orthodoxies, will be much more tolerant of a wider range of viewpoints than their immediate elders, and certainly than their teachers. But maybe that's a naive hope.
We may have tomorrow's rebels being small c conservatives and not particularly rebellious at the moment. I'd have thought that.
Well, being a small c conservative is in fact incredibly rebellious thing to be at the moment.
And just on to a final question. I'll take you back to 2014, where you were asked for some commitments you'd like to make, ideals you'd like to be remembered for. You gave two. I think it was three actually, but I'll quote two here. Independent mindedness and keeping the flame of Western civilization alive. And I'd say you probably succeeded in the first. Certainly, contrarian every year would cap that. But what about the second? Flame of Western civilization.
Yeah, I don't seem to be doing a very good job on that front. I think in some ways it's unhelpful to label the values I prize as being the exclusive preserve of Western civilization, because that's quite a divisive way of describing those values, and invites people who don't see themselves as part of that tradition not to share them. And it also risks linking them with some of the historic injustices perpetrated in the name of Western civilization. So I prefer to think of those values now as values like religious tolerance, a belief in free speech, a belief in the rule of law, a belief in respecting our history and our heritage, though not never questioning it. I like to think of a belief in the importance of the scientific method, of reason and logic. I like to think of them not as Western values, but as universal values, which over the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, numerous different cultures have contributed to and helped us get to the place we are today. Not just the Judeo-Christian West. So I still believe in those values and will still do my best to promote them. But I no longer think of them as Western values. I think of them as universal values which benefit everyone, regardless of where they're from, who they are.
And are you optimistic in terms of keeping them alive?
Well, I think things will probably get worse, Matt, before they get better. I thought in February of last year, when I helped found the Free Speech Union, that the free speech crisis across the West had reached rock bottom, that things couldn't get any worse, and that support for free speech would begin to rebound. And actually, things got worse by an order of magnitude over the next 20 months. So when I'm tempted to think now, things just cannot get any worse. It can only get better from now on. I check myself, because I hadn't anticipated things would get so much worse over the past 20 months. Maybe the next 20 months, things will get even worse. So I tend now to kind of err on the side of caution and be quite pessimistic. And I do think that things will probably get worse before they begin to get better. But I do think eventually good sense, reason will prevail.
Well, Toby, it's been fascinating speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed your time on Sketch Notes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt.
Okay.